Last Sunday evening, Andy had for us a devotional in which many of our young men read passages and we had songs. And it was a very, very good service about abiding with the Lord. And at the end of it, when I did the invitation, I asked you to close your eyes and I read the 23rd Psalm to you. And I didn't mention it was the 23rd Psalm, but I doubt anybody here didn't know where I was talking about. But I want us to, in giving thought to that and bringing something together this afternoon to say to you this evening, I want to kind of go back to that and revisit the 23rd Psalm this evening. So if you will turn with me there. It also matches my sermon this morning. It was a passage I actually wanted to mention in my sermon this morning, but given all that we had going on and everything, I got up here about the time I usually stop for this morning, and that's okay. We had good worship this morning, and we had plenty of things going on, and that's a good thing. But so I had to cut out a little bit of my sermon, and I'm going to add that in and tie that in also with the idea of abiding from last week, and look at also a furtherance of our idea of goodness. And that word shows up later in the 23rd Psalm. And so I want to spend a few moments with that this evening. 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The 23rd Psalm has a lot of things in it, and we could talk for a couple hours about some of the depths of this, and maybe not even get it all. But the 23rd Psalm is primarily, it's written from the perspective of a shepherd, written by King David, who is a shepherd of sheep. We don't know exactly where David wrote this in his life. I kind of think it was early in his life, and most of the scholars do. It was very likely one of those evenings in which he was out with his father's sheep as a young man, in which he looks out over the sheep and he thinks about where they go and what they do and how he leads them, and recognizes how that takes place. When you look at this psalm, to a large degree, it's basically a year in the life of a sheep. And when you look at it, it's very much that way. Let me give you just some things to notice. Because the Lord's my shepherd, I'll not want. He takes good care of His sheep. His sheep aren't destitute. They're not in a mud pit like sometimes you'll see animals in. They have the ability to be in lush pastures. They are content with plenty to eat so that they'll even lie down in green pastures. They're well fed. They're well taken care of. He leads them beside still waters. Sheep don't do too well with rushing water. They like water that's slow moving, and they become skittish without it. He leads them in paths of righteousness, takes them in a way that is the right way, the good way. He doesn't take shortcuts, but He takes the way that is best for the sheep. And He takes them even through the valley of the shadow of death. There are a lot of places when you're in the wilderness that you've got to be aware. If there are wolves and there are bears and there are lions and such that David encountered, that you got to be careful. The predators that prey on sheep and other animals like them like those shadows, like the narrow passageways where the sheep are close together. Even in those difficult passages. When the shepherd would have the sheep. What they would typically do in the nomadic shepherds is that they would take and they would go, much like the Native Americans did in our country. They would have a summer grazing land and they would have an area that they wintered in. Generally, the summer area was a higher elevation and the winter area was a lower elevation so that you take advantage of a little bit warmer weather. The shepherds in David's time did the same thing. They would go up into the high mountain tablelands in the summertime. And they would do so because it was cooler. They would do so because it was then that part of the land was lush. In the winter is a rough place to be. And so they would come down to the lower lands. And when they would migrate to the lower lands, they would have these ravines, these caverns that they would go through, the crevices in the rock. And it was very much like that, where they go through the valley of the shadow of death, where it was perilous. But it was a transition time. And that with that transition time and the difficult times of life, even when there's a shadow of death, because the shepherd is with them, they didn't have to fear. David's sheep were safe because David was with them. David knew he was safe because he knew the Lord was with him. The rod and staff, instruments of the shepherd to help protect, correct, and watch over the sheep. They were a comfort even though they might enact discipline. When they would go off to the high plains, in Spanish, the word mesa means a high plain. It's also the Spanish word for table. And because it's a tableland, land kind of like a table. It's up high and it's flat. And very often, the shepherds would go and they would check out the land. And if there were any poisonous plants, and that happens sometimes, that there were poisonous plants in that part of the world, that sometimes when they would go and find those poisonous plants, or if they found any obstacles like a hole or something like that, they would deal with it. And they would get it ready. They would look it over to make sure there were no predators that had taken residence. And very much it was preparing a table for the sheep for the summer. Because in the summer, in that tableland where it was the lushest and greenest of all grass, that's where they had their lambs. They would have their lambs and they would raise them for the first few weeks. And they would spend that time in that area. As a sheep, they would spend the summer in the tableland. You know, also, why is a tableland such a good thing? Because it's able to be done in the presence of enemies. Sometimes the best place to hide is right out in the open. Because in a tableland, a predator doesn't have the shadows, doesn't have the rocks, doesn't have the crevices. It may seem vulnerable to be out in the tableland. The valley of the shadow of death may be a lot scarier. And maybe the tableland may seem scary, but in reality, the tableland, you can eat out there on the tableland, and the wolf or the lion or the bear, he can watch from a distance. But if he tries to make a move, the shepherd is able to cut them off before they get there. And so the table is prepared. Also, you see that he says, you anoint my head with oil. Certainly a sign of David's kingship, but also a sign of what they did to sheep. They would anoint the sheep with oil upon their heads, put oil on their heads, put it between their ears and around there, and they did it as an insect repellent, and did it as a health issue. Because see, if there's oil on the head of the lambs or the sheep, and right behind their ears, the places that the insects will try to bite and dig and all those things, that the oil would keep the insects off of the sheep. And so not only does the shepherd love the sheep to put them in the best of pastures for the winter and the summer, watches them through the narrow passageways, comforts them with his rod and staff. leads them in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake, takes care of them to lead them beside still waters. The shepherd watches over them. David says about that, after that my cup overflows. I have everything I need and more. And then he gives a closing to the 23rd Psalm, and that's what I want us to notice this evening. He says, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, the dwelling in the house of the Lord forever is the part that related to last week's lesson Sunday evening, and that is abiding with the Lord. What it means to abide with the Lord, and to expand on that just a touch before we go back to the goodness and mercy, is that abiding with the Lord is that David, as the sheep, recognized he abided with the Lord in the green pastures. He abided with the Lord beside the still waters. He abided with the Lord through the valley of the shadow of death. He abided with the Lord in the table that was set before him. He abided with the Lord when his head was anointed with oil. He abided with the Lord when his cup overflowed. And he abided with the Lord all the days of his life. And certainly that's what it means, that God is there to help, to guide, to lend aid all the way through. And so, at the end of this life, when this life's all over with, it doesn't end there, it only gets better. It gets to where we are a part of God's eternal kingdom in heaven, and we're able to be there with Him for all of eternity. And so we abide with Him forever. Now back to the first half of verse 6 and how it ties into this morning. We talked this morning about goodness. We talked about how it's one of the fruit of the Spirit. We talked about how that goodness is very much like that it's about doing good, doing right, even when it's tough, enacting it even when it's difficult. And that goodness may not always be gentle. And sometimes it might not even be necessarily kind, but it's good. It's the right thing. When you read that and think about it, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Does that sound like a charmed life? It does to me, doesn't it? Do you? I mean, to say, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. Did that happen for David? You remember how David's story went? You know, David became king, and David, after being king a while, saw Bathsheba, committed adultery with Bathsheba, had her husband Uriah killed, and Nathan said, "You are the man in the parable about the man with the one sheep and the man with the one lamb," and the rich person had taken that and did that. You remember what was told to him, that the sword wouldn't leave his family and he was going to have trouble from then on? And what were some of those troubles? Well, Absalom, one son, killed another son, Amnon, because he took bad advice from Jonadab, a friend of his, which the bad advice involved him raping his sister Tamar. And Absalom got even with Amnon and killed him. So, one of David's daughters was raped by another one of his children. Then he was killed in retribution for having committed the rape by another one of his sons. That son leaves for a while, but when he comes back, Absalom decides to set himself up as the most powerful of all of David's sons. He was the oldest at the time. And so he sets him up as that, and he comes into the city daily with great fanfare. And eventually he starts holding court and stopping people going to his father and starts intervening. And eventually he just decides to take over the whole kingdom. David has to flee Jerusalem for his life because his own son Absalom was trying to take over the kingdom and kill him. Absalom through a war. It was not only a civil war among just God's people, it was father against son. And Absalom was killed, and David mourned greatly over that son Absalom. Before that happened, the child that he and Bathsheba were going to have died as well. David had also on his deathbed another son, Adonijah, that decided to rise to the throne and tried to take everything over, tried to do exactly what Absalom had failed at. And yet he too was defeated. And eventually Solomon became king. 2 of his sons died while trying to bring on a coup in the nation. One of his sons was killed by another son. A daughter raped because of largely his neglect and trying to raise his children the way he should have. All kinds of mess happened. There were some plagues that came upon because of the counting of the people that he was told not to do. David's story is not all pleasant. There's a lot of gory details in the life of David. And never mind all the wars that he engaged in all during his time. And so, I read that to you again. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. Do you believe that's true? With being reminded of what all David went through. And I'll tell you, I still believe it's true. And I'll tell you why. Yes, David had a rough life. It was his own undoing. It was his own fault. But that didn't take away from the fact that God was with him. Even through the valley of the shadow of death, God was with him. When he was running for his life from Absalom, God was with him. When he was in the middle of great battles, God was with him. When King Saul, earlier on in his life, tried to kill him, God was with him. All through the things that he went through, God was with him. And so it's not a lack of problems that shows God's goodness in our life, but it's the fact that God is with us every step of the way. You know, when you look at it, we've been looking a good deal at the Apostle Paul in the missionary journeys. And I think Paul did goodness. Paul did good things all throughout his life. We saw this morning how Paul was able to stand before the Sanhedrin and say that he'd done everything in a good conscience. Could you say that? I know I couldn't say that everything in my life I've done in a good conscience. I can safely say there have been times in my life that I have violated my conscience. Now, I've repented of it, sought forgiveness of it, but I don't know that I can make that statement. I'm not going to ask who all could here either, because I doubt there's many that could say they've always done what was right in their conscience. But Paul had a rough go. Paul had a lot of difficult things that happened in his life. But yet, Paul was able to do it all because God was with him. When Paul was beaten, when Paul was stoned, when Paul was left for dead, he still had God's goodness with him. And through all that David went through, God's goodness was there. Now, how that relates to us is that whatever we're in, whatever difficulty we're going through, we should always follow the path of goodness. We should always follow the path of doing good because it is good, because it is right. And we must always do that. If we do that, then God's goodness and God's mercy will follow us. It doesn't mean we're going to have a lack of problems. Doesn't mean we're going to have a totally easy life, because King David sure didn't. But what it does mean is we'll have the strength and the help to make it through, so that someday we'll be able to dwell in the house of the Lord forever. You see, nothing took away the wolves, the bears, the lions. Nothing took away the dangers. The dangers were there. And the dangers were in David's life. And sometimes the dangers got up close and personal when his own sons tried to kill him. And those dangers were there. And maybe even if the dangers had killed him, it wouldn't have changed that God had been with him every day in every way. And so it is with us. If you're not a Christian, I'm not asking you to become a Christian because everything's easy. I'm not asking you to become a Christian because everything is perfect as a Christian. But I'm asking you to become a Christian because there's forgiveness. There's grace. There's mercy. There's goodness that'll follow you all the days of your life. Doesn't mean you're going to have an easy life. Doesn't mean everything's going to be perfect. Doesn't mean everything is going to be exactly the way you want it to be, because it sure wasn't with David. But what it does mean is that God's goodness of faithfulness will be with you every step of the way. His goodness will be there. His mercy will be there. And no matter how tough this life is, we have a better life to come. And for that we can rejoice. And so, if you're not a Christian, please come and become one. If you are a Christian and you need to give your life to Christ, you need to come for prayers. We want to issue this invitation. Would you come while together we stand and sing?